So when you think of the Mughal Empire, what pops into your head? Maybe the Taj Mahal or legendary emperors covered in jewels? For more than 200 years, they were the masters of a vast and complex land. But how did they pull it off? We're going to break down the genius behind their rule and the fatal flaws that eventually brought it all crashing down. Let's dive in. Okay, so let's start with the central problem, right? Imagine it's the Middle Ages. How in the world do you even begin to rule a place as enormous and diverse as India? It's a logistical nightmare. So many empires had tried, and honestly, most of them just burned out pretty quickly. But the Mughals, they were different. They didn't just conquer territory, they built a system, an administrative machine that was so effective you can still feel its echoes today. I mean, get this. When the Prime Minister of India gives a major national address, where does he do it from? The Red Fort, a Mughal palace. That's no accident. It's a massive symbol of just how deep their legacy runs. So, who exactly were these incredible empire builders? Where did they even come from? Well, their identity is actually a lot more complicated than you might think. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The Mughals had this dual ancestry. From their mother's side, they were descendants of the Mongol conqueror Genghis Khan. But on their father's side, they came from Timur, a powerful ruler from Iran and Central Asia. Now, you'd think they'd probably claim both, right? Not a chance. They actually hated being called Mughal or Mongol, because for them, Genghis Khan's name was tied to brutal massacres. Instead, they were incredibly proud of being Timurids, especially because their great ancestor Timur had actually captured Delhi way back in 1390. And they didn't just talk the talk, they made sure everyone saw it. They had these amazing paintings made. They're almost like historical group photos that show the whole line of Mughal emperors sitting right next to their ancestor, Timur. It was a brilliant piece of visual propaganda, basically saying, see, this is our lineage. This is why we have the right to rule. So, how did this family actually set up shop in India? Well, it started with a military revolution. In 1526, the first emperor, Babur, showed up on the battlefield with cannons. This was a total game changer, and it helped him crush the Sultan of Delhi. His son, Humayun, had a bit of a setback and was exiled, but he came back and recaptured the throne. But the real architect of the empire, the one who built it into a powerhouse, was the third emperor, Akbar. His reign lasted for nearly 50 years, and it was just a period of massive, relentless expansion that cemented Mughal control over almost the entire subcontinent. Okay, so winning battles is one thing, but actually controlling all that land and all those people day in and day out, that is a whole other challenge. And this is where the real genius of the Mughals comes into play, the administrative machine they built. And right at the core of this whole machine was one key position, the Mansabdar. The easiest way to think about it is like this. If the empire were a giant corporation, the Mansabdars were the senior managers. The name literally means rank holder, and it was this really smart grading system that laid out the exact status, salary, and military duties for every single noble working for the emperor. So, how did this system actually work? It was basically a three-part deal. First, a noble gets a rank, a number called a zat. That number decides their position in the hierarchy and how much they get paid. Second, they had a military job to do. They had to maintain a certain number of cavalrymen, or saur, ready for battle. And third, and this is the truly brilliant part, they didn't get a paycheck in cash. Instead, they got a jagir, which was the right to collect all of the tax revenue from a chunk of land. It was an amazing way to fund the entire army and keep the nobles loyal, all without the emperor having to empty his own treasury. But, having a great army and a killer administrative system isn't quite enough to hold an empire that diverse together. You need an idea, an ideological glue that can unite people from totally different backgrounds and faiths. And this quote, wow, it comes from Emperor Jahangir, talking about his father Akbar's big idea, Sol-e-Kol, which basically means universal peace. See, Akbar would hold these deep discussions with leaders from all sorts of religions, and he came to a pretty radical conclusion, that strict, dogmatic religious rules just caused division and conflict. So his solution was to promote a universal code of ethics, things like honesty, justice, and peace, that would apply to absolutely everyone, whether they were Muslim, Hindu, Christian, you name it. In a world constantly ripped apart by religious wars, this was an incredibly forward-thinking vision of tolerance. And for a long, long time, this whole system worked beautifully. But as we know, even the mightiest empires have a shelf life. And by the late 1600s, some very serious cracks started to show up in the Mughal foundation. So what went wrong? Well, the problems really started from within. For one thing, they didn't have a clear line of succession where the oldest son just takes over. That meant every time an emperor died, his sons would fight these bloody, destructive civil wars for the throne. At the same time, that brilliant administrative system started to break down. The number of nobles, the mansabdars, just kept growing and growing, but there wasn't enough land to give out as jagirs. This created a huge crisis. Officials got desperate and started squeezing the peasants for every last penny, which led to incredible suffering and eventually massive destabilizing revolts. To really wrap your head around the scale of this problem, I want you to just look at this number for a second. 61.5%. What in the world could that possibly be? Well, that number represents the absolutely staggering inequality that was at the heart of the empire. This chart is from Shah Jahan's time, and it is just mind-blowing. It shows that a tiny, tiny group of the highest-ranking nobles, just over 5% of them, controlled over 61% of the empire's entire revenue. Think about that. Almost all the wealth was flowing to the absolute top to fund a life of unbelievable luxury for a very small few. But for the farmers and laborers at the bottom, the people actually creating all that wealth, there was practically nothing left. A system that unequal simply cannot last. It was a ticking time bomb. So, as the emperor's central power began to crumble, the empire started to fracture. But here's the thing. It didn't just vanish into thin air. Its legacy, its very system, was just too powerful for that. What happened next is absolutely fascinating. The Mughal administrative system was so well built that even as the empire fell apart, the regional governors who broke away to form their own independent kingdoms in places like Hyderabad and Awadh, they just copied it. They created their own dynasties, but they used the Mughal framework to run them. And for a long time, they still formally paid respect to the emperor in Delhi as their ultimate leader. The system, incredibly, outlasted the central authority. And all of this leaves us with one final big question to chew on. The Mughals had this incredibly high-minded ideal of sulh-e-kul, of universal peace. And yet, their empire was born from conquest and maintained through constant warfare. So it raises this fundamental tension that we see throughout history. Can an empire that is forged in violence ever truly achieve a state of genuine universal peace for everyone living within it? It's something to think about.